So now we're going to start going into the loop territory. So the first one we're going to talk about is a for loop, because as you guys go on, if you do any more programming classes after this one, you'll see that for loop will end up being the most common one you use. It might not be the most common one you use right now because it can get kind of funky sometimes. So, but for loops will be one of the most useful tools later on, especially if you guys notice, because you guys probably you guys have learned arrays, and you know to iterate through an array, you typically just use a for loop because it does everything kind of nice for you. So the structure of a for loop pretty much always follows the same thing. We do our initialization. So this is where you typically do like your int I equals 0. And keep in mind, it doesn't have to be I. I is just kind of like the standard. You can name the variable whatever you want, but I is typically the standard, and it typically represents iterator. That's kind of like shorthand for iterator, but you can name it whatever you want. And then the condition. So this condition right here is basically, you can think of it like a condition in an if statement, because this is kind of what you would put in an if statement, right? Like if I is less than 5. So the condition would look exactly like how it would look in like an if statement. So basically what it's saying, like in this code down here, is that we want to keep running the code while I is less than 5. So the moment it's 5 or greater, this code should stop. And then right here is our iteration. So iteration is just what we're doing with I to get basically, this is our, how do I word this? So what are we doing with I to get closer to this condition, I guess? That's probably one of the better ways to put it. So I++, you can think of it like I, just keep in mind, if you haven't really worked much with I++ or not really sure what it does, it pretty much just means I equals I plus 1. So just think of it like that way. And you don't have to have I++ there. You could have something like I equals like I times 2. And that will make it like, get to this condition faster, because instead of increasing by 1 each time, it's doubling each time. So this condition is just basically any way you want to increase I. But most of the time, you're going to be doing like I++. You want to increment it one at a time. So yeah, if we run this code, I starts at 0, so it'll print hello world 0. Then it goes up to 1, checks the condition again. 1 is less than 5, so it goes back into the for loop, and then prints out hello world with the new I, which is 1. Goes back up, iterates I to 2, and then so 2 is less than 5, and then we basically keep doing that until after we print out hello world 4, we go back up to the for loop, iterate I to 5. Well, 5 is no longer strict, because remember, this is strictly less than 5. So it's not less than or equal to. So when I is 5, 5 is not less than 5. So this condition is false. So that means then it will stop the iteration. So what it would print out in this case is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it doesn't print out hello world 5 because 5 is not less than 5. Make sense? And then keep in mind, when we get to the next section, I think the next part is while loops, is that this condition right here is essentially what you would put in it would be the only condition in the while loop. So like I could say like while I is less than 5, like this is just the stopping condition, similar to, yeah, so I literally did it right here as well. So I used the same condition, I is less than 5. So it has the same stopping condition. So in this case, while loop, it doesn't have any like iterate or anything. It's just looking for a condition over and over again. It's not having any. In this case, we're doing it slightly different, but in the most part, like the while loop itself, like the condition, it just is looking for a specific condition. It's not incrementing any variables. It's only looking to check while I is less than 5. And then in about 2 slides, we'll go over when it's better to use each one. So if you have a question on that, just wait till those slides. So while loop is simply just the condition. There's no variable, or there is a variable, like that's typically what you're checking the condition for, but there's no variable that you're like incrementing or anything. You don't have to, it's only like the middle syntax of the for loop, which is just our stopping condition. And that's all it is. So it's basically keep running this code until this is false. Similar to the one before, but we're not like doing int I equals 0, int I is less than 5, I++. It's simply just the stopping condition. So this is actually what we did in this case is this code right here is actually, it will do the exact same thing as the code from the previous slide. So if we go back, oops, let's do while loops. So if we go back, so we are actually using an iterator in this case. What we did is we set I equal to 0 before the while loop, and then we say while I is less than 5, system dot out dot println hello world at I, and then iterate I. So this is basically the while loop version of how to do the code previously. But you don't need to do it this way. So like, let's say you wanted to have, make a program that keeps taking in user input until they type the word hello. So in that case, like, you don't really need an I because you're not really incrementing anything. You're just looking for a certain condition, while they type hello. So basically the condition in there is like, while, the word they type in is not hello, keep taking in user input. So the moment they do type hello, this becomes false, and then it will stop the while loop. So while loop is just checking for a condition, while for loop is incrementing something and checking the condition. And we'll go over which one, like when to use one and when one's going to be better over a different one. So do while loops are very similar to while loops, but the difference is that a while loop checks the condition first and then does the code, while a do while loop will do the code first and then check the condition. And in a good amount of situations, they will do the same thing, but I'll show you a different situation when they do something different. So the syntax is basically we do our do, brackets, then our code, basically inside the while loop, and then our while condition right here. And the one thing about a do while is that you do need a semicolon here. I don't know exactly why, but in the form of the syntax for a do while loop, this part has a semicolon. So it's different than, if you notice from the previous slides, the while loops and the for loops do not have semicolons. Only the do while it does. I can't tell you exactly why, that's just the syntax. And if you don't know what the word syntax means, it's basically just like the structure, like how it's laid out. Like syntax means you have to follow the syntax for your code to work, essentially. So yep, right here, it's similar. It does the exact same thing as a while loop, but instead of checking the condition first, it checks the condition last. So in this case, we have int I equals 0. Basically the same code as we had before, but in this case, we're doing a do while loop instead of a while loop or a for loop. So we print out hello world at I, increment I, and then it checks the condition. So the difference would be is, what if I set I equal to 5 right away? So it like fails this condition. Well, in a do while loop, it will still actually print this. It'll still run the code first because it didn't check the condition yet. It never checked if I is less than 5. So even though I is 5, it'll still run this code first and then check the condition and be like, oh, I is 5, so now it stops. Compared to the while loop, where if I set I to 5 right away, so if I set I to 5, like right here, it'll check the condition first while I is less than 5. Well, I is 5, so it doesn't even run this code at all. So that's the difference, is that a do while loop will always run at least one time. And that's why typically do while loops are typically a little bit better with menus, if you need to keep like printing out a menu, because you normally want to print out a menu at least one time. They could print out a menu and then hit quit right away, but it still needed to print out the menu once. So typically a do while loop would be better for menus. And I think I actually discussed that when we go to when a loop is better than another. So yeah, just keep in mind that a do while loop is essentially just a while loop, but instead of checking the condition first, it checks the condition last. Simple. So now we're going to talk about when to pick a certain loop over another. And keep in mind, you can use basically any loop. Like all loops can be used interchangeably. Like I can make, if you notice, all these do while loops and for loops and while loops all do the exact same thing. So they all print out hello world 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you can make, like, I can make a while loop that does the same thing as a for loop, and I can make a do while loop that does the same thing as a for loop. But sometimes, if you notice, like here, it's a lot less code. Like this is basically just 3 lines of code compared to the other 2, which is like 5. Okay, 4 lines of code. Oh, I guess the for loop was 2 lines of code. So yeah, this one's double the line of code. So they do the exact same thing, but sometimes it's more efficient and looks better to use one over the other. But they can all be used interchangeably. So for loops are normally best when you either know, when you want to know how many times the loop runs, or when you know the exact stopping point. Like I want this loop to stop after 5 iterations, like 4 iterations, 3. When you know exactly how many times you want the loop to run, typically a for loop is better. Well, a while loop is typically better when you don't know or don't really care how many times it runs. You're just wanting to run until a stopping condition is hit. Like for example, like the example I brought up earlier, is like if I want to keep taking in user input until the user types in hello, and then I want to do something when they type in hello. Well, in that case, I don't really care how many times they type in numbers before I get to hello. I only care about when they type hello. So in that case, a while loop would be better because I didn't care how many times it went through the loop. While a for loop, it does care. It will count how many times it went through. So like an example for a for loop is like when you want to print something exactly 7 times, a for loop is typically better in that situation because then you have your I variable and you do I plus 7 times. And then, while I is less than 7, do this. So that's when for loop's better. So an example is like when you want to print something while the user input is yes and stop once it's no. Yeah, like in that case, we're not really caring how many times they type yes. We only care about when they type no. So in that case, we're not really counting. We're just looking for a certain condition. And a do while loop is basically has the same, same premise as a while loop, but typically when it's better is in stuff like main menus. When you want to do something at least one time, then do while loops are typically a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to step away from the while loops or from the loops. Anyone have any questions on any of this? We probably are going to end up going, because normally this was supposed to end at 1, but it'll probably go over that, so it's not a big deal. You guys can leave at 1. This will also be, it'll also be recorded. So I put it like a tentative time of 1, but we'll probably go over that. Cool. If no one has any questions, then we're going to move on. So we're going to talk about infinite loops. So infinite loops are bad, obviously, right? Because it means that it's never going to leave the while loop, which means your program is never going to run, or never finish running, which is bad. And I bet all of you have run into an infinite loop at least once, and you'll do it many times. And I still do it all the time. So we know that an infinite loop happens is when the stopping condition is never met. So taking this code below, it's basically the same code we've been using for the while loop. So we say int I equals 0, and we say while I is less than 5, and we print out hello world, but we took out the I plus part. That means we never incremented I. So I is always 0, but the condition is always checking if it's going to be greater than or equal to 5. Well, that condition will never be false. Since I is always 0, 0 is always less than 5. So this code will run infinitely. It will never stop. And most of the time, that is not good. So, because your program will never finish, and then I don't want to say it can crash your computer, but it will take up a lot of memory in your computer. Not fun. So if you're ever getting an infinite loop, the reason is that this condition is never being met, so you need to figure out why it's not being met.